My name is Robert, and I need you to understand something that's happening right now in real time, while most people are watching the wrong game. The Federal Reserve just executed a move that quietly transferred wealth from your pocket into the system's survival mechanism. No announcement, no vote, no permission, just a policy shift that sounds technical but hits your life like a freight train. And if we don't decode the mechanism, we become the mechanism. Here's what just happened. The Fed held rates at what they call restrictive levels. That's the headline. That's what gets repeated on financial TV. But here's the part they don't say out loud. Inflation is still running hotter than the yield you're earning on safe assets. Translation, your savings are melting, not crashing, not vanishing, melting, slowly, quietly. And that slow melt is the entire strategy. Let me break this down with precision because the confusion is the weapon. When the Fed sets interest rates, they're not just managing the economy, they're managing debt, specifically government debt. And right now, that debt is so large that traditional solutions have been taken off the table. They can't cut spending without political suicide. They can't raise taxes enough to close the gap. And they can't default without triggering a global financial meltdown. So what's left? Inflation. The silent tax that doesn't need Congress to approve it. Here's the mechanism. The Fed keeps rates high enough to sound tough, but low enough to keep the government's interest payments from exploding. Meanwhile, inflation runs at a pace that erodes the real value of all that debt. The borrower, the government, pays you back in full. But the dollars they pay you back with buy less, much less. That's not a side effect, that's the plan. Now, watch what this does to you. If you're holding cash, you're losing purchasing power every month. If you're in savings accounts, you're earning maybe 4%, but prices are rising faster, so you're still going backwards. If you're in government bonds, you're locked into yields that don't compensate for real inflation. You feel responsible, you feel safe, but the math is punishing you for that responsibility. This is where the psychological trap gets vicious. The Fed will tell you they're fighting inflation. They'll point to rate hikes. They'll use words like data dependent and patient. But if real yields, the return after inflation, stay negative or barely positive, they're not fighting inflation. They're managing it. They're keeping it at the exact temperature needed to melt debt without boiling over into panic. And here's the contradiction that should wake everyone up. The Fed says they want to bring inflation down to 2%. But if they actually succeeded in getting inflation to 2% and kept rates where they are now, the government's debt burden would become catastrophic. Why? Because real interest payments would spike. The budget would implode. So the Fed is trapped. They need inflation higher than they admit. And that need becomes policy, even if they never say it in those words. Now, let's talk about who wins and who loses in this setup, because the distribution is not random. It's structural. The first receivers of newly created money are not workers. They're institutions, banks, asset managers, large corporations. They get access to cheap credit before prices adjust. They deploy that capital into assets, real estate, equities, commodities. By the time the inflation reaches wages, the price tags have already moved. So the system creates a timing advantage, and timing is everything. This is why we're watching two economies operate simultaneously. Asset holders see their portfolios inflate. Wage earners see their purchasing power deflate. Same inflation, different impact. And that gap is not an accident, it's the design. Because inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. It hits based on where you sit in the money flow. If you're close to the source, you hedge. If you're far from the source, you absorb. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. This strategy requires savers to lose. Not dramatically, not visibly, but consistently. Because if savers could actually preserve wealth and safe assets, the debt burden wouldn't transfer. The government would be forced to deal with it directly. So the system needs negative real rates. It needs your savings to be a slow leak. And it needs you to feel like that's just how things are now, like it's normal. But it's not normal. It's engineered. And the engineering is sophisticated. The Fed doesn't just set rates. It manages expectations. It signals. It communicates. It uses language carefully designed to keep confidence intact while the mechanism runs underneath. They'll say higher for longer to sound hawkish. But if higher still means negative in real terms, they're not tightening. They're pretending to tighten while the debt keeps melting. Now, let's get forensic about how this affects you practically. Your salary might go up 3%. Your rent goes up 7%. Your groceries go up 10%. Your car insurance goes up 15%. But official inflation says 3.5%. So your employer feels justified giving you 3%. Social Security adjusts by 3%. Your cost of living is running at 8%, but the system only compensates you for 3.5%. That gap, that's the invisible payment. That's where the debt reduction happens, not on a spreadsheet, in your life. And this is where measurement becomes a weapon. Inflation isn't just something that happens. It's something that's calculated, and the way it's calculated determines everything. If the methodology changes, if substitutions are allowed, if quality adjustments are made, the official number can drift below lived experience. That drift is not a bug, it's a feature. Because every percentage point the official number runs below reality is money the government doesn't have to pay out in adjustments. Now here's the question nobody wants to ask. If this is the strategy, what stops it? What's the limit? And the answer is confidence. As long as people believe the dollar will hold value, the system can keep running. But confidence is fragile. It's built on perception, habit, and trust. And once it cracks, it doesn't crack slowly, it shatters. We've seen this script before. Weimar Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Turkey. Different scales, different speeds, but the same core dynamic. When governments can't fund themselves through taxes and growth, they fund themselves through currency debasement. And the public pays the bill, not as a tax, but as a decline in what money can do. The difference now is sophistication. The Fed has tools previous regimes didn't have. They can manipulate yield curves. They can intervene in markets. They can coordinate with global central banks. They can use language to shape behavior, so the process can run longer and smoother than historical examples. But the math doesn't change. You can delay the reckoning. You can't delete it. So what does the Fed need to happen next? They need inflation to stay elevated but not explosive. They need rates to stay high enough to maintain credibility but low enough to keep the debt serviceable. They need asset prices to stay inflated so wealth effects support spending. And they need you to keep participating, keep working, keep saving in the system, even as the system slowly redistributes your purchasing power. This is why exits get closed. Cash used to be an exit. Hold physical currency, stay liquid, wait for opportunities. But cash loses value by design now. Negative real rates make cash a liability. Gold used to be an exit, but gold doesn't pay yield, and in a system that punishes non-yielding assets, gold becomes a fringe choice. Crypto is supposed to be an exit, but regulation is tightening, and the more people try to leave the system, the more the system builds walls. And here's the next step that's already in motion. Central bank digital currencies. If money becomes fully digital and programmable, the control becomes absolute. Negative rates can be automatic. Spending can expire. Transactions can be monitored, restricted, or blocked. The escape hatch doesn't just close, it gets welded shut. No, let me be direct. This is not fear-mongering. This is incentive analysis. The government has $38 trillion in debt. It's growing every year. The interest on that debt is becoming the largest line item in the budget. Cutting spending is political suicide. Raising taxes is political suicide. Defaulting is economic suicide. So what's left? Inflate the debt away while keeping the public calm. That's the only path that doesn't cause immediate collapse. And here's the trap. The more successful this strategy is, the more permanent it becomes. Because once policymakers see they can manage debt through inflation without triggering revolt, why would they ever go back to hard choices? Why would they ever accept austerity or default when they can just let the calendar do the work? This is why the middle class gets crushed. Not because anyone hates the middle class. Because the middle class is where the money is. They hold savings, they hold bonds, they hold fixed incomes, they try to be responsible. And in this system, responsibility is what gets punished. The wealthy hold assets that inflate, the poor receive transfers that adjust somewhat, the middle class holds currency and watches it evaporate. So what breaks first? I'll tell you what breaks first. Behavior. People stop saving. People stop trusting long-term planning. People chase yield into increasingly risky assets just to keep up. Retirement becomes a gamble. Housing becomes an investment first and a home second. Debt becomes rational because borrowing in a currency that's losing value is smarter than saving in it. The system doesn't collapse, it corrodes. And that corrosion changes how we live, how we plan, how we relate to money, how we relate to the future. It turns the economy into a game where sitting still is losing. And that constant pressure, that constant need to move, to hedge, to protect, that's exhausting. That exhaustion is the cost of keeping the debt machine running. Now here's what I need you to understand. This isn't about predicting a crash. This is about recognizing the water we're swimming in. The Fed is not your friend. They're not your enemy. They're the debt manager. And their job is to keep the system running, not to protect your purchasing power. Your purchasing power is the variable they adjust to keep the system stable. So where does this go? It goes until one of three things happens. 1, inflation spirals out of control and confidence breaks. 2, rates rise so high that the debt becomes unsustainable and the system is forced into default or restructuring. 3, control tightens enough that exits close completely and the population accepts permanent financial repression as normal. Right now, we're in scenario 3. And scenario 3 can run for a very long time if managed carefully. Look at Japan. Decades of financial repression, negative real rates, massive debt. And the population adapted. They stopped expecting returns. They stopped expecting growth. They normalized stagnation. That's the blueprint. So what do? You stop thinking like the system wants you to think. You stop believing that cash is safe, that bonds are conservative, that following the rules will protect you. You recognize that the rules have changed, and you position accordingly. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but strategically. You hold assets that can't be debased. You reduce exposure to fixed income. You understand that volatility is the price of preservation now. You accept that the easy path, the path of sitting in dollars and waiting, that path is the losing path. And you make peace with the fact that the system is not designed for your benefit. It's designed for its own survival. This is the new reality. The Fed just made your savings worth less, and they'll do it again and again until something breaks or something changes. And the only question that matters is this: are you going to keep playing by the old rules while the game has already changed? Or are you going to adapt? Keep your eyes on real yields. Keep your eyes on exits. And remember, the wealth doesn't disappear. It just moves. And right now it's moving away from anyone holding dollars and into assets the system can't dilute.